Timothy Joseph.
This is Criminal Behaviorology. I'm your host, Timothy Joseph. And I will start out by saying that I want to thank all the people that have listened to the podcast. We've had some success, rather good success in last few weeks. The interview with Joe Wyatt was very well received. A lot of downloads on some of the other episodes. The one about Darius McCullum. A lot of success with the podcast that covered hostage negotiation. Remember that one? So I've gotten some praise. People from all over, from Mexico, from different parts of the United States, liked and appreciated the podcast and has sent me messages on it. Pretty good conversation today, and it has to do with a lecture I saw in the library in Muskegon. That's the name of the town, Muskegon, Muskegon, Michigan, by author Tobin Buhk. The book, one of his many books, True Crime Michigan, the state's most notorious criminal cases. True Crime Michigan examines crime in the state and explores the landmark cases of robbery, mob activity, and murder that have received national attention. Included here are accounts of Andrew Kehoe and the Bath School Massacre, a case I had not heard about, by the way, until just maybe a couple years ago. The rise and fall of the Purple Gang in Detroit, the Michigan victims of Lonely Hearts killers Beck and Fernandez, and the mysterious disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, and the criminal career of Coral Watts, the serial killer Coral Watts. So I called up Tobin, emailed him actually, and he called me, and had a really good interview about true crime writing, and the interest in true crime. So this is True Crime Michigan. Some of the themes in here apply to any state and perhaps any country about why people are interested in true crime, why crime is fascinating from a historical perspective, and just the rather unique cases that we cover. If you like what you heard, go ahead and write us back, and go ahead and like it on the Facebook page, and let us know about any future topics you'd like to hear about. Once again, thank you to our listeners, and let's go ahead and listen to the interview with Tobin Buhk. Hello, Tobin.
Yeah, hi, Tim.
How are you this evening?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for calling.
Sure.
If you're all ready to go, can I just go ahead and start the interview?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, can you pronounce your last name for us?
Yes, Buhk.
Okay, Buhk. That's exactly the way I was going to say it. Right? Yep.
Really? Not
Yes.
too many people say it right, so that would have been great.
How else do they pronounce it? B-U-H-K.
I get Bunk, believe it or not.
Okay.
Buck. Buhk. Right. So yeah, there's a lot of different variations of it,
Yeah.
but people don't generally get it right.
Okay.
So.
Welcome to the show. I enjoyed your lecture at the library in Muskegon.
Thank you.
I have seen your books in the local library. How many books have you written?
11.
11. And they're all on true crime?
All crime related, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you are a teacher of history?
Yeah, and English. I teach English too.
Okay. And how long have you been a teacher?
I've been a teacher for 24 years professionally, so I've been around for a little while.
Wow. You must like the profession then.
I do, yeah. I mean, it's just there are a lot of changes that have taken place in the profession, and you know how it is. Not all changes are good.
Right, for sure.
At the state level, there's a lot of stuff that's happened that I wish they could sort of undo, but I do like the profession.
Very good. What led you to write about true crime?
When I know the Kent County medical examiner well. He's a friend of mine. And there was a period of time where I think he was a little irritated with something that is known as the Csi Effect. And what happens is you and I and others wind up getting conditioned by the type of, by the TV we watch. So if you watch, like, I was interested at the time, I was watching a lot of Law and Order Special Victims Unit. And if you watch a show like that, you look at the medical examiner, you look at what takes place in the televised reality, they can get these cases wrapped up, they can get DNA evidence, all kinds of stuff, and they can do this all in 50 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, what happens is because that becomes our reality, a layperson's reality, and because we serve the juries, that can lead to something known as the Csi Effect, where the most insidious aspect of the Csi Effect would be a juror who is willing to accept shoddy testimony from somebody just because he's got a few letters behind his name in a lab coat.
Mm-hmm.
And so my friend and soon-to-be co-author decided that it might be fun to kind of write a book describing what really takes place in a morgue without the televised reality, with unvarnished.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent a year as a morgue volunteer, got my gloves bloody, helped out with Autopsy, and wrote 2 books about it. And so those are the first 2 books. And then I love history, always have had a love for history. So sooner or later, my interest in forensics and my love of history was going to come together, and I have been writing about historic true crime ever since.
Just curious, about how long does it take to do a typical autopsy?
Depends on the medical examiner.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Cole tends to be a little bit more deliberate, and a couple hours, hour and a half, 2 hours. Sometimes they can do them much quicker than that. It just depends on what the nature of the situation is. So, for example, if there's been a victim who's been shot 32 times, they'll have to probe every single bullet wound. The same would be true for stabbing wounds. And so autopsies like that can go on for a really, really long time, hours and hours, because they'll have to go and probe the depth and trajectory of each bullet wound.
Mm-hmm.
So it just depends. Where if it's a heart attack, it might be much quicker than that.
Mm-hmm.
So generally about an hour and a half, 2 hours.
Uh-huh. Do they take the brain out and weigh it? I've seen videos like that.
Yeah, they take it out and they cross-section everything. Everything comes out, everything gets cross-sectioned.
Mm-hmm.
Everything.
Yeah, that must be interesting.
Yeah, and I think in the days past when they did autopsies, they basically didn't do everything like that. I think there was a time where if there was a brain injury, they looked at the brain, and if there was a stab to the chest, they looked at the chest. Mm-hmm. And maybe there are some jurisdictions where they still function that way. I know with the Kent County folks, and this would be true of the Ottawa County folks too, they do complete autopsies from stem to stern. Everything comes out, everything gets cross-sectioned. Mm-hmm. So they are complete.
Excellent. And when you talk about Kent and Ottawa counties, of course, you're talking about the counties of the great state of Michigan.
Yes.
And your book, one of your books, is True Crime Michigan, which this looks like, going over all your books, kind of a sampling of some of the more interesting cases you've encountered through history. Is that a good description of it, or?
Yeah, it's kind of a bloody history of Michigan. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's a sampling of the state's history through some of its most notorious criminal cases.
We have certainly had some interesting ones here, and I'm going to focus on, the ones that caught my eye, and we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. But I do want to ask about Chapter 2, about Strang Circumstances, the murder of Michigan's Beaver Island king. What can you tell us about that case?
So it goes back to Mormon history. Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram, I think his name was, were in Illinois. They were taken to a local jail. I don't know, some trumped up charge. The Mormons were constantly being harassed by other groups that didn't like the way they were going about their religious business, and Joseph Smith and his brother, I think it was, got dragged out of a jail, and basically they were going to lynch him, but I think they shot him or beat him to death or something. And what happened is the Mormon group splintered from there. The part of the group followed Brigham Young, a bigger chunk of them, the bulk of them followed Brigham Young to Utah, where they established the colony. But a few of them traveled north to Beaver Island, where they established a group under James Strang. Mm-hmm. And Strang was very much like Joseph Smith. He had claimed to have been visited by an angel and had dug up some plates with some mysterious writing on it.
And Joseph Smith being the founder of Mormonism.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know just too much about it, but Smith was in Mormon belief was visited by an angel who took him to a tree, and they unearthed some plates that was supposedly the history of the 12th tribe of Israel that had come to the New World. Mm-hmm. And anyways, that became the Book of Mormon.
Right.
So anyways, James Strang establishes a group on Beaver Island, and I think that it's often reported that he declared himself king of Beaver Island. I don't think that's quite accurate. I
Mm-hmm.
think that he declared himself king of his church on Beaver Island.
Right.
Which it might sound like splitting hairs, but anyways, so James Strang was the leader of this colony on Beaver Island, and I think that they acquired a lot of territory of Beaver Island. Some people say they acquired it through some underhanded means. Again, it gets into how people felt about Mormons at the time and the kind of discrimination the community felt, but
so
one way or another. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, yeah, Beaver Island, it's a small island in Lake Michigan.
Yeah, it's northern Lake Michigan. It's so Lake Michigan's kind of like a long fin. Mm-hmm. It's toward the top of it. Mm-hmm. It's actually pretty sizable. I mean, it's got an airport on it. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's not sizable compared to say Cuba, right, or something like that. But it's a fairly big. I think it's the biggest island in Lake Michigan. It's considerably larger than say Mackinac Island is. It's got population.
Right. Yeah, so it had a population at that time, even when Strang and his followers came to that island.
Yeah.
And did it cause conflict when Strang and then they were been referred to as the Strangites came to that island, and he declared himself king of the church?
Yeah, there was definitely some consternation there. I don't know exactly how much. I think because the way the Mormons were treated by other groups, it's just hard to find anything that isn't varnished. You know what I mean? I mean, like a lot of the opinions are real biased against them. But it has been said that a lot of the territory that they wound up accumulating on Beaver Island was accumulated through underhanded means. But again, like I said, that's just kind of a varnished opinion, so it's hard to know for sure. Mm-hmm. What we do know is that he was the government was very iffy about him because they basically felt like he had sort of declared himself king of a piece of property within the United States, and we don't have kings here.
Right.
So there was a lot of there was a lot of animosity, I think, of the U.S. government towards James Strang. And funny thing is his demise came down to the fact that he had put a law on the kind of a dress code on people on the island, and this was not well received. And so some of his own followers conspired to shoot him, and it was said that they shot him in full view of a U.S. naval vessel with the crew on the deck watching it, that they may have even possibly known about it at that time and turned a blind eye, simply because it was in the government's best interest to have him out of the picture. And again, that's just hard to say when you're talking about how far back we are in time. Reporting and newspapers not being quite like they are today. So, interesting history.
Were the perpetrators prosecuted?
Yeah, I think the guy who shot him was a guy named Bedford, and I think they were prosecuted. But I think that if they did any time at all, they were basically let off with a hand slap. I'd have to go back and look at the book. Out of all the cases, that's the one that I'm probably least familiar with, to be honest with you.
Well, what I read in there was that, or I read it somewhere, that they got a fine of $1.25.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Hand slap.
Right. So it could. And Strang was did he serve as a state representative at one point?
I believe that he did, yes.
Yeah.
Smart man. I think he was a smart guy. I don't think you were talking about a dolt, by any stretch of the imagination.
And do you think that, just what we know about the case, if this had he not been assassinated, could he be like a well-known religious figure in American history at this point?
I would tend to say no.
Okay.
I would tend to say that he would have probably been looked at more as like a crackpot.
Okay.
Kind of like the House of David. Are you familiar with that?
Right.
That people don't generally look at that. I'm generalizing now. I mean, there are House of David followers around today.
Right.
But I think at the time it was kind of considered to be a cult.
Are there still Strangites to this day?
I think there might be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd read someplace that they had relocated south.
Okay.
After the assassination or execution, if you will, depending on whose perspective you want to look at.
Yeah. Another case that I wanted to do an episode on this on the show. I'm not too far from there. Is Bath, Michigan? Andrew Kehoe and the Bath, Michigan Massacre.
Yeah, we can talk about that. Absolutely. I wanted to mention one other thing about Strang.
Go ahead.
What's interesting about religious leaders, cult leaders, if you will, is if you look at their personalities, sometimes they have really strong, overwhelming personalities that, as a result, people are very easily manipulated by them.
Right.
And there's a cult of personality that develops.
Right. And
I'm not drawing any particular parallels here, but if you were to look at, say, Jonestown.
Right.
What was that fellow's name?
Jim Jones.
Jim Jones, yeah. And then, of course, you've got David Koresh, right? And these are people who there was a cult of personality that developed around them, and they were seen as almost like messiah figures among their followers, and that has a lot to do with the strength of their personality. It seems like I've read or seen some documentaries about some other cult leaders like that, where their personalities are just very, very strong. You could probably do a really interesting comparative study of the personality traits of those types. And Strang, to me, might fall into that kind of category.
Right.
But again, of course, his religious belief aside, right? So, the Kehoe Bath Massacre, from what I understand about Andrew Kehoe, from my study of that case, he seems to be kind of a garden variety sociopath. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't have used that term back then. In fact, it's kind of funny, when he blew himself up, they recovered their skull. And there's an there's a news article in the Toledo Blade which covered that case in depth. And they mentioned that they were going to take the skull to the University of Michigan for a study by the anthropology department. And the article goes on to talk about how it could be that basically was a throwback to a primitive age who had become confounded by living under modern laws, and he snapped. So the article is essentially opining that he might have been like a Cro-Magnon man that somehow made it into the 20th century. And
that sounds like a throwback or popular at the time. That you ever hear of the ideas of criminologist Cesar Lombroso? He was an Italian.
The name rings a bell. So we're talking about like phrenology now?
Yeah. It was his belief that somehow the parts of early man, the genetics of early man, were cropping up among people that we call criminals now, and he even had, examinations of the skull size and the brow and so forth.
That's what that is then. I mean, it's kind of interesting because, like, I wrote a chapter in my True Crime Civil War book about the Lincoln conspirators, and the source about that case is a Baltimore reporter by the name of Ben Perlipore, whose transcript of the trial is even better than the official transcript, because he witnessed it all and he's able to give you a pretty idea of the back and forth and the way things are said to one another, whereas a cold hard transcript won't really convey that kind of sentiment. But he talks about how he watches these, he observes these defendants in the dock, and he describes them. And the way he describes them, Lewis Payne in particular, he talks about them in terms like their outward appearance can reflect what their inward vibe is.
Right.
Sinister looking, sinister brow ridge.
Right.
And it's interesting because by 1927, when Andrew Kehoe did what he did, you would think that age of phrenology had passed, but apparently there were some remnants of it still. So
apparently there was a school of phrenology in the United States up until I think the 1960s.
Oh, really? It went that late?
Yeah, and there was one in Europe, Great Britain, maybe up until the 1970s. I'd heard that before.
Okay, wow. So really late then. That's interesting.
Yeah, some habits, well, some belief systems die hard, I guess. So tell us a little bit about what Andrew Kehoe did.
Andrew Kehoe was doing some custodial work to the Bath School, which was a 2-wing school that had double floors. And he had planted Hercules dynamite and some other explosive devices in the walls and beneath the floor, and he had that attached to timing mechanisms that were set to go off with the 8 o'clock bell. So the idea is, on the appointed day, the 8 o'clock bell, morning bell would go off. The timing mechanism would blow up the explosive devices and bring the school down. Mm-hmm. And that's precisely what happened. But the first wing, so the Bath School was configured with, it was an L-high building, so it was, I think, K6 in one wing, and or maybe K8 in one wing and 912 in the other wing. Mm-hmm. I think if memory serves me, a lot of the 9 and 12 kids were gone that day. Mm-hmm. It didn't really matter, but when the 8 o'clock bell went off, the explosion took down the whole elementary wing of the building, and the top floor collapsed in on the bottom one. But the second set of explosions never went off because apparently the trembling from the first explosion was so severe that it caused a disruption in its timing mechanism for the second one. Mm-hmm. So that basically spared that second wing entirely. So people at Bath, from my understanding, were racing to the rubble, and they could hear. Some people, of course, were killed on impact. Others were buried, partially buried. They could hear the screams, and they started climbing through the rubble. Meanwhile, Kehoe drives up in his truck in a running board, and he had the superintendent, Emery, and it's Huyck, Hike, maybe it's pronounced. He, of course, knew Kehoe, so Kehoe, he came over to say hello, and he put his foot on the running board. At that instant, Kehoe had taken a shotgun or a rifle, and he had turned to the back seat where he had loaded the truck up with a bunch of rusty metal from the farm and had some dynamite in there, and he used the gun to explode the dynamite. It turned his entire truck into like a great big shrapnel, great big grenade, taking him and the superintendent with him.
Go ahead.
So they also, when the investigators came later and were able to identify Kehoe as the culprit here, they went to his farm and they had discovered that he had, prior to that morning, had murdered his wife and then burned her up in a wheelbarrow. Mm-hmm.
So what was Kehoe's motive in all this?
Well, the historical motive that is bandied about most often in the secondaries writing about this case was that he was miffed about school taxes, and he was worried about losing his farm because he couldn't pay the school taxes on all of his land. I'm not sure whether that would have been, an adequate motive. I don't think he ever actually talked about motive. I think that was just something that was speculated about later on. I think that he had gotten up and he was very angry at school board meetings, and he was an outspoken critic about the way taxes were done. And I think because of that fact, people pin that motive on him. But I don't. Seems kind of like a simplistic motive to trigger the bloodiest school day in U.S. history. But anything's possible. He could have just snapped. He could have been a complete sociopath. Hard to say for sure.
It's just maybe for some people it's a little surprising that somebody like this could own a farm and at least have a job, and then at a certain age do something of this magnitude. Yeah, and I think that there's a lot about human psychology that people don't understand. But what happens is when you have a situation like this, people always want to search for a reason. There has to be a motive in this. There has to be some kind of grand reason why somebody would do something like this. I think for people who have lost loved ones in tragedies like this, it also helps that there's motive. And you have, with the news media at the time, and that article that I talked about a few minutes ago, where they're talking about phrenology, it's got a kind of a grasping at straws kind of feel to it. Right.
Like they just don't understand him, and they want to, but we might just be dealing with some element of abnormal psychology that was simply not identified at that point in time. Simply something that they didn't understand.
Yeah, people want a singular reason. They want a single thing they can point out and say that was it, instead of looking at it kind of multi-factorial, or that's a little too heady and maybe a little too confusing. Not what people seem to want to hear.
Well, you know how that, like with Columbine, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, but with Columbine, didn't they ultimately settle on the fact that the shooters were bullied real badly?
That was one of the explanations, yeah, that they got bullied, and then they planned it and took their revenge on, and partly that was based on some tapes that they'd made, that they got bullied or something like that, yeah.
And maybe that's what happened. Maybe that's what the motive was. But whether it was or whether it wasn't, it gave a grander meaning to the tragedy, I think, for people. And that's what I think you see with Kehoe, except it's not. It may not be that simple with him.
Yeah.
And maybe the true answer might be really uncomfortable. It's easier to vilify a guy like that and say, well, he just didn't want to pay his school taxes. He's a miserly bugger. He snapped it. I read someplace that, or in my research, I read in one of the sources that Andrew Kehoe was an electrician by trade, and he had an accident when he was a younger guy out west. I want to say Kansas City or St. Louis. He fell off a ladder and he hit his head after shocking himself, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And in my research with serial killers, a lot of the serial killers that I've studied over time had some type of a closed head injury to the frontal lobe region.
Uh-huh.
And it could very well be that he had some type of a TBI that affected him in a way that he became a very mean-spirited individual later on. There's a lot of speculation. He beat a horse to death, I think.
Uh-huh.
There's some speculation that he murdered a woman years before the whole massacre incident. And so there may have been. I mean, it's hard to say. Again, we're speculating. It's kind of like Monday morning quarterbacking, but there may have actually been a physiological reason why he became what he became.
Uh-huh.
But again, you have to be careful with explanations like that too, because everybody has a TBI doesn't go haywire like that.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
There's all kinds of people.
It could just be the right type of the wrong type of injury with the wrong type of personality.
Yeah.
And it may be something we don't understand yet.
Yeah. The right combinations, all these different combinations came together in just such a way that it resulted in this event.
Yeah, absolutely. Or in this individual who fathered this event.
Right. So, speaking of very unusual events, the subtle and daring poison plot of Arthur Waite.
Yeah, Waite is a case that, if I want to make any appearance of any dateable female Blanche, because on the outside he looked like the perfect guy, the perfect match. On the inside, he was something much different.
And describe the case for us a little bit.
Arthur Waite was a native of Grand Rapids who went to University of Michigan Dental School, and after he graduated, he went to South Africa, working for a dental firm called Wellman and Bridgman around World War I, 1914. When the war broke out, he came back. Supposedly, as the story goes, he came back to the United States and set up a dental surgery in New York. Of course, later on, that was proven to be nothing but a fiction, that he wasn't licensed to practice dentistry in New York. But he, according to one of the investigators who worked the case, as soon as he came back to the United States, he went heiress hunting. It was always his desire to get rich quick, and his get rich quick scheme was to marry into the Peck family of Grand Rapids.
That's heiress hunting, to find a rich woman
heiress,
to marry.
Heiress hunting. Yeah.
An heir to a wealthy place, to a wealthy fortune, and just marry her, and you become rich yourself.
Yeah, well, and I think that he might have, at that point in time, even conjured up the idea of marrying into a wealthy family and then systematically eliminating them so that he could inherit the money. Okay, so I think that there's some evidence that he was looking at this right way back when he graduated. I think he graduated in 1909 from Michigan's dental program. And later on, when the case broke, it was discovered that they had looked at one of his books, textbooks from dental school, and the pages involving arsenic had been dog-eared and flipped through much more than the rest of the book. And it was not a big part of the curriculum. They used arsenic to kill nerves, I guess, root canal surgery back then. So way back then, he had a fascination with arsenic. Well, why? So that's speculation. So 1915, he marries the daughter of John Peck, who is a super wealthy, seven-figure fortune, kind of scion of Grand Rapids businessmen. And he starts to acquire bacteria and germ specimens because his plan is to wipe them out by spiking their food with bacteria, but he can't get it virulent enough. The apartment he lives in isn't a laboratory, so he goes to the old tried and true, and he spikes his in-laws' food with arsenic. So first he had murdered Hannah Peck, who was the mother-in-law. Then he murdered John Peck, the father, and at that point in time, his wife was positioned to inherit half of her parents' fortune. She, of course, did not go to the father's at-home funeral because she was already sick. He had already infected her with typhus, which makes sense because in his scheme, she would have had to be the next one to go.
He infected her with typhus?
Yeah, he used an atomizer nasal spray and infected her with typhus. Yeah. So they gave her a blood test. She was so sick when she came to Grand Rapids for the at-home funeral, she couldn't leave the hotel. They gave her a blood test. They found typhus. It was typhus or typhoid. One of the typhus. I'm pretty sure it was typhus. Because they're different, I guess.
Right.
Two things. So I was pretty sure it was typhus. And there's even one rumor that he had designs on murdering her brother and his entire family.
Okay.
So that his wife then would inherit the full Monty.
Yeah.
And he could then go off to Italy with his mistress and, live the life of Riley on the Peck's dime.
Yeah. If you're going to go to that much trouble, you might as well wipe out the whole family then.
Yeah, and I think that, his case is so fascinating because he basically experimented on the people. He had become real, kind of a adopted son-in-law of Aunt Catherine. So the Peck family was from New York, so some of them had remained behind in New York, and they were pretty well off. Catherine was at a big dwelling in New York City, and he used her to experiment with the various germs and things. And he was and his plan was, I understand, was to poison her because he felt that her fortune, she was intestate, she didn't have any children. So I think he believed that when he poisoned her or killed her off, her fortune was going to go to her favorite niece, which was his wife, which was Arthur's wife. So he would have kind of like a double whammy. Now, Catherine survived the event, testified, and her testimony is some of the most fascinating testimony in the whole transcript. Mm-hmm. She had said that she had a marmalade that she had loved from a certain deli, mm-hmm. and she sent Arthur to go get some, and when he brought it back, it had sand grit in it. It was gritty to the teeth. Uh-huh. And she took it back to the delicatessen, and the deli owner had no idea where the grit could possibly have come from. He was mystified, but it turns out that what Arthur had done was ground up glass and put it in the marmalade. Because he figured that was one way he could get rid of her.
Right.
Try to spike her food with fecal material. You can let your mind wander as to where that came from.
Right, yeah.
So, this was the type of thing that he would have done, that he did do, actually.
Is this reminiscent of Rasputin, where they try and poison him in all kinds of different ways and he just won't die? And
well, it's kind of got that kind of feel to it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and the murder of Hannah Peck, she died almost right away, but the murder of John Peck has got that feel to it. And what's really fascinating about this case, there's a lot of fascinating parts of this case, but one of the most fascinating ones is they had him so dead to right that when it came to the trial, he had one chance only to stay out of the electric chair, and that was to convince the jury that he was insane.
Uh-huh.
And so he got up and testified to all these exorbitant attempts to try to murder John Peck. And it's almost certainly exaggerated, but it's our best evidence of what he tried to do. So you have to kind of look and see what's believable, what's credible, and what is incredible.
Uh-huh.
But he said things like he would he wet down the boot so that John Peck would catch his cold and that type of thing.
Uh-huh.
At one point in time, one juror started laughing because no one was buying it.
Uh-huh.
So that also has kind of a Rasputin feel to it.
Right. So how was Waite ultimately caught, and then what was his fate?
He was ultimately caught. He had the body of John Peck embalmed, and he and his wife, who was already sick at this point, and the corpse were headed back on a train to Grand Rapids. And there was a pseudonymous telegram that was sent under the name of K. Adams, who incidentally was the name of was the name of the victim in one of the city's most famous arsenic poisoning cases. That's why that pseudonym was chosen. That telegram was sent from Grand Central Station by a young woman by the name of Kay Adams, who had shown up with an older man to send the telegram. And the telegram said, suspicion aroused, stop, demand autopsy, stop. So it was addressed to Percy Peck, who was Clara's brother and John and Hannah's son, also an heir to the fortune. Mm-hmm. And he didn't really like Arthur very much. He had heard some rumors about Arthur's behavior.
Uh-huh.
In college, he was a skirt chaser. He stole things. And so he got a friend of the family who also happened to be a mortician meet him at the train, and when Arthur came off the train, he demanded the baggage checks for the body.
Uh-huh.
The mortician takes the body to his shop, and they take a look at the stomach, and they find a white crystalline powder. They take the stomach out, and they send it to Dr. Victor Vaughn, who is an expert chemist and kind of an authority on these things at the University of Michigan. And meanwhile, they went through and they had the funeral at home. They didn't really tell Arthur that they were going through all of this. Vaughn's report comes back that it's got tons of white arsenic in the stomach, and they start watching Arthur Warren Waite. And with Clara too sick to travel, he returns to New York and he starts to cover his tracks. Mm-hmm. One of the things he tried to do was pay off an embalmer an absurd amount of money, $50,000, I think, to say that he used an old batch of embalming fluid that contained arsenic, because it was against the law at the time to use arsenic in embalming fluid. And ultimately, he took an overdose. Some people say to commit suicide. Some people say he just accidentally took it. But he gave the first in a series of confessions.
Uh-huh. Okay. And he was taken to the electric chair?
Yes. Yep. He was tried. He was found guilty, and he was electrocuted in Sing Sing in 1917.
Okay.
May 1917. Yep.
Right. That's a fascinating case. I with these kind of psychopathic personalities, it seems like if there's one consistent thing, it's consistent lying. Like they just cannot tell the truth.
And they're good at it.
Yeah.
They're real good at it. That is one of the. I think that's one of the hallmark characteristics of a sociopath and a psychopath is the idea that they're just expert liars and manipulators.
From an early age.
He was just really, really a good liar. Mm-hmm. In fact, he was such a good liar that his wife was under the impression that he was a dental surgeon.
Right.
And he took her to various hospitals. She waited in his car, and he'd go in and come back an hour later, and he'd tell her that he had done these dental surgeries. She had no idea that he wasn't even licensed to practice anywhere in the state of New York. And when he was out working, supposed to be working, he was actually cohabitating with a married cabaret dancer at the Plaza Hotel. And no one knew this. I mean, Claire was blown away when she found out about all this. So that's a manipulator extraordinaire.
To be that smooth of a liar, that there's something about that is so atypical. I mean, if any of us, I would think, would even try and lie to a tenth of that degree, we'd be a nervous wreck. And
scary, how scary it is, you know, that people are out there like that.
Right. Well, what does it tell you, like when you examine true crime from the perspective of a historian? What does that tell you?
One of the things that it just can't be emphasized enough is how history sometimes goes in cycles, mm-hmm. and it repeats itself sometimes in some really nauseatingly similar ways. If you look at some of the cases that I've written about over time, or just old historical cases, and you look at MOs and reasons for things, these things come up time and time again. And so what it tells me from a historical perspective is that there are lessons to be had in these old crimes that can be applied to crime today. Mm-hmm. And not necessarily like arsenic and strychnine and the way they handled crime scenes. All that's changed. All that's different. We don't deal with phrenology or anything like that anymore. But the human mind, the human mind broken, or the human mind that is perverted to do criminal acts, sometimes you can find some real parallels there. And I think for me, that's probably the biggest takeaway, is that you study old crime. And I'm always telling people when I speak about this publicly, is that these seem like they're crimes. Well, these are crimes from yesteryear, but in many, many ways, they're echoes that we can hear right to our current day. Mm-hmm. You just pay attention to certain crimes. A woman named Amanda Timmins in 1869 takes her 3 children to the Kalamazoo River. She drowns them one by one in the river, mm-hmm. right? And you're going to see a very similar type of thing like that happen today. Those types of things happen today.
Right.
We have psychological reasons for them,
uh-huh.
explanations for these type of behaviors that wouldn't have applied to Amanda Timmins. But if you look close enough, you can see some real parallels between cases.
Right. Why is true crime so popular anyway? And I'm as guilty as anyone. This is criminal behaviorology, and I've read a bunch of these books. But why do you think it's a popular subject, and it's been a popular subject for a long time?
I think it's a gaper's block. Mm-hmm. I think it's the same dynamic as a gaper's block. I mean, you know what I mean by a gaper's block?
You may have to explain that to me.
Okay, so, you're driving down the highway, and there's an accident. You're on a divided highway,
uh-huh.
superhighway, and there's an accident on the other side. And traffic slows down, and there's no reason for it to slow down because the accident is on the other side of the median. Uh-huh. So why are people slowing to a stop? Slowing to a stop because they want to see. Uh-huh. And that's called gaper's block, because they're gaping at the accident. Well,
right.
Why do they want to see an accident?
Uh-huh.
There's a morbid fascination with it. Mm-hmm. And the morbid fascination might be kind of a mirror into what some of our fears. I think people are fascinated by things that make them afraid.
Right.
That makes any sense.
Right.
So Gaper's blocks make a lot of sense because they're morbidly fascinated, and anybody who goes by one's got to be thinking, anybody who's configured, I hate to use the word normally, but configured in the right way, I guess, has got to be thinking that, my God, that could be me, right? And that's every time you get behind the wheel of a car. I mean, you see these signs on the highway. Oh my goodness, so many fatal accidents in this month and up from last year. You know what I'm talking about,
right?
And people stop because they're morbidly fascinated with that. And I think that's what we have with crime. It's a morbid fascination. It's a gaper's plot.
Yeah.
I mean, I spent all that time in the morgue, and I saw a kid who was run over. He was killed by a car. He ran across 28th Street, which is a busy thoroughfare here in Grand Rapids, on a rainy night. And to look at that boy, that 19-year-old, 20-year-old, laying there, or the heart attack victim who's let his weight go, ate too many, greasy foods, right? We're looking at that, and I'm thinking, my God, this could be me.
Right.
Right? I'm one step away from this. But yet, as horrific as that is, it's also just magnetically fascinating.
Right.
So that's kind of how I would explain that. People are really fascinated with that abnormal psychology and that seedier side of the world. It's like you don't want to live with it, though. Do you know what I mean? I mean, you don't want to. Most people don't want to go into a morgue. They don't want to volunteer for an autopsy. They don't want to become part of the crime scene unit. They just want to read about it and watch it on TV.
Right. There's enough of a psychological distance to watch it on CSI or read a true crime book that you can be comfortable with it, but still have that gaper's block or interest in the true crime.
Oh yeah, and I think that if you were to go to a real bloody crime scene, where you could smell the blood, that type of thing, you would probably have far fewer people that are interested in it, because that's a first-hand experience. Just is much different than doing it by proxy.
Yeah.
By proxy, people are fascinated. Firsthand, they're horrified.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Right. Very much so. What's your next book going to be about?
The book that I just put out. In fact, it's not actually. I think it might actually now be out to the public. I have copies of it that so I think it's available. It's called Pardonable Matricide. And it's a gaslight era crime that took place in Jackson and Detroit. And it involved an inmate named Robert Irving Latimer, who was so dangerous. He was considered the most dangerous inmate in a Michigan prison. And he inspired 3 different conversations, debates really, about whether they wanted to bring a death penalty to Michigan. Pharmacist, and wound up selling drugs to inmates in the prison, and he lucked up a batch of prussic acid, poisoned his way out. So really a fascinating case.
I'm going to check that one out for sure.
I appreciate that. Yeah, called Pardonable Matricide.
Pardonable Matricide.
Matricide. Yep.
Tobin
and then
Buhk.
There's a big subtitle. Robert Irving Latimer, from the most dangerous inmate in Michigan to free man, I think might be the subtitle.
Okay. We'll look it up. At Andrew Kehoe's farm, once he destroyed the farm, and they came, and he'd had some kind of he'd made a plaque or a thing on a board. It said, criminals are made, not born.
Not born, yeah.
What do you think he meant by that?
That's that he was trying to send a message to the world that something had pushed him into doing this.
Right.
That's what I think he was saying. If you want it could be the school taxes, right? It could be something else.
Right.
I just something about the school taxes to me just seems like a real flimsy excuse for killing a bunch of children.
Right.
Right. I mean, I could understand something like that if his crime was committed against a school board or the superintendent himself, but to go after the children like that seems to me, but I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, it's kind of fun to speculate, but I think that to answer your question, that's what he was doing. He was telling the world that there was something that pushed him into it.
Basically, he was saying, they made me do it.
Correct. Yeah.
Instead of him being responsible for it, they made me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of those commonalities with criminals, don't you think? I mean, if you hear enough of them interviewed, they always have, they're innocent, of course, but, if you get any of them that are honest enough to say they did it, they'll say, well, they made me do it.
Yeah. They always abdicate responsibility in one way or another.
It seems to be that way, doesn't it? That seems to be one of those parallels that you see.
Check us out on Podomatic.com or Anchor.fm for this podcast, as well as our Facebook page and our blogger page.